Hello and welcome to this Hut8 Consulting Network Techtorial. This Techtorial is going to be on Cisco's iOS Resilient Configuration feature, and this is an absolutely fantastic feature to enable on your routers that are running iOS. So what are the goals and objectives of this Techtorial? Well, I want to give you the best and most comprehensive introduction into Cisco's iOS Resilient Configuration technology. We're going to do some practical demonstration. We're going to explain how the features and functionality of iOS Resilient Configuration work. And we're going to talk about the different use cases where it could be applicable. So here are the Techtorial waypoints. In other words, where are we going to be stopping along the way to have a quick discussion, to go to the command line, and to take a look at the different features of the iOS Resilient Configuration. So first of all, we want to start out by explaining what is Cisco's iOS Resilient Configuration feature set. Well, it allows you to secure the primary OS running image. So in other words, if I have multiple iOSs in Flash, whichever iOS image is currently running, that's the one it's going to allow me to back up. And I'm not just going to back it up, it's actually going to be hidden 100% from view. And I can also create a secure point-in-time archive of whatever the current running configuration may be. Now, there are some caveats here. We can enable this feature remotely or via the console port. However, it can only be disabled via the console port, and there's a very good reason behind this. If we stop to think about it, if I'm able to hide the iOS image and to ensure that even if someone came in with malicious intent and was going to do something destructive like format the flash, I would want to make sure that the only way to turn a safety feature like that off would be if you had local physical access to the router. And so that's why the feature can only be disabled via the console port. We'll see what happens when you try to disable it via a telnet session, or I should say a VTY line that was spawned from a telnet session. Now, the backup configuration, as I said earlier, it is only a point-in-time copy. So in other words, if you're making lots and lots of changes to the configuration, unless you disable only the config backup of the secure boot and then re-enable it, you're not going to see those updates. So it's point in time, which means when I type in secure boot-config, that is the copy of the running configuration that I'm going to be able to pull back and restore. Now, the iOS image, when I type in secure boot-image as opposed to secure boot-config, I can only back up the iOS image if it resides on the router, right? So if I'm booting from the network, it's not going to back up that image that's being booted over the network. It must reside locally on the router. So how do we enable iOS Resilient Configuration? Well, it's actually too easy to turn this on. It's two commands. Now, these commands are mutually exclusive, which means you don't have to do both. And when I go to configure those here in a couple of seconds, you'll see that we can do one and not the other. But when you stop to think about it, doesn't it make sense to do both, right? You can't afford not to do both here. It's not costing you anything. And if you've got a golden config, right, or let's say a golden let's say a base config that you want to make sure that gets loaded onto that router if for whatever reason something destructive does happen, then you would want to enable both of these features. So let's get onto the command line right now. We're going to be on router 8 right here. And you can see that we are in user exec mode. Well, let's do enable and get into privilege exec. Put in our password here. And let's go ahead and say show secure boot set. So as you can see, iOS image and configuration resilience is not active. Well, we want to turn these things on. But before we do, let's take a look at the Flash directory. You can see right there, there is the current iOS that's running on this router. Now let's watch and see what happens here as we work our way through the commands to enable things. So when I say secure boot-image, and I'll do a question mark, that way you can see there's nothing that follows it. this is going to secure the iOS image that sits in Flash. In fact, when I run this command, you're going to see that that iOS file is going to disappear from view when we type in dir. And there's not going to be a way for us to see that unless we ended up at the ROM prompt. And I've got a picture of what that looks like. But let's go ahead. We're going to get a syslog message here. It's going to be severity level 5 or notification. That's the way I like to remember it's notification. It's level 5. And there it is. We see the facility is iOS resilience, right? The severity level is 5. It's a notification level. And then what's the mnemonic? Image resilience active. We successfully secured the running image. And as promised, when I say do dir now, take a look at what it comes back and says. It says no files in directory. Again, we've hidden the configuration, or I shouldn't say the configuration, we've hidden the iOS image from view. So now someone on the router, if they were to say do show version, you can still see the version that's being run, but when I say do dir, the file is not there. And what's happened, it's more important than trying to prevent somebody from seeing what version of the iOS you're running. The importance of this is going to come when I go to format the flash and we reload and the router boots. And it's going to boot to this version of Cisco iOS. That is the value add of the secure boot dash image command. So now let's validate. We're going to work a little ahead here. So if I was to say do show secure boot, and which is short for secure boot set. When we take a look here, you can see iOS resilience router. So there's my serial number, and the image resilience is on. And it's on for this iOS image right here, 1514M12A. However, configuration resilience is not yet active. So if I didn't care about the config, if my only concern was being able to make sure that the router would reload successfully using this image, then I've just done that. But again, let's say that, we'll say do write mem, we'll save our configuration here, and we'll say that, you know what, I want to keep the configuration the way it is. So we would simply say we would say secure boot dash config. And we're going to get that syslog message again, a different one this time. And this is important here. So we see the facility is iOS resilience. The severity level is 5, config resilience active. But here's the important part. And this is also sort of an interesting little piece as to how all this is going to work. So the configuration is now archived off and hidden from view. And you can see that it says that it's been done in Flash, that's where it took place. But when we type dir, we don't see it. It's been hidden from us. And the reason lies in that little period right there. And what the Cisco IFS, or that file system that Cisco uses, is doing is exactly what Linux and Unix do. In other words, any file name that begins with a period, irrespective of what follows it here, these characters, numbers, letters, any file that begins with a period is considered hidden in Linux and Unix. So when I enter a directory and I type ls, I will not see a file that begins with a period. And typically, these are customization or configuration files, like your .bash rc or the .bash underscore profile, right? In other words, files that are read when the system starts up, not necessarily files that you would need to see when you type ls. Now, if we use the -a option in Linux and Unix, we would see those hidden files. However, with iOS, there's no way for me to see that unless I'm in ROM-mon mode. So now when I say do dir, you can see it tells me it's showing me the contents of the Flash directory. But from what we've just seen, we know right now that this cannot be the case, because it's telling us it's archived the running config off. It's also telling me that we've got a copy of the current running iOS 15.1 M4. So let's go ahead and do this real quickly. If I were to say let's save our config here, right? And we've enabled things. So show secure boot set. And so it's been activated for both the iOS image as well as the configuration. So someone accesses the router remotely and they've got malicious intent. And we'll start that over here on router 2. So we're going to say that router 2 is our bad actor. We're going to go from user exec to privilege exec. And I'm going to telnet to 10.0.28.8. And this is router 8. And let's say that I figured out that someone left admin as the username and password, and then I just took a wild guess and said, well, maybe the privilege exec password is the same thing. And it is. So as you can see, I'm now on router 8. So what's interesting is when I say show secure boot set, what am I going to see? Yeah, I'm going to see that it's enabled. But what's going to happen? Because again, we're saying that I'm a bad actor here. I've got bad intentions. I've done my reconnaissance. I've collected all the information off this router. Maybe I did a screen scrape of the running config, and I'm going to go to work on the passwords later for the different users that are defined here on this router. But again, I've got bad intentions right now. So I'm going to get on here, and I'm going to say no secure boot. And we'll say image, right? And take a look at the message we get here. You must be logged into the console. Again, this is protecting me. There's no way for me to delete this backup config. There's no way for me to get at that image that's been archived off remotely. Remember, if I'm on the console line, it's a whole different story. And to be honest, if you have someone on unauthorized and unaccessed at the console port on your router, I think you've got bigger issues than what we're discussing here, right? Because that means that someone is physically standing next to your router, right? We're talking about the remote threat here. So again, I can't turn off the boot image. Well, what about the boot config? Can I at least get rid of that? No, I can't. Now, what's been happening in the meantime is you'll notice that this little blue eye lit up here in our tab for router 8. And what that means is that something output has come to the screen of router 8. And let's take a look. Very interesting that we get a severity level 5 syslog message telling us non-console configuration request denied, and it gives us the command. So if we have a syslog server, we can now see that someone has attempted to turn this off. So again, let's go back to router 2, from where we are telnetted into router 8. And we figured out that, you know what, okay, I can't make the change. I can't turn this off, but that's okay. Because I'm a bad actor, I'm going to do as much damage and be as intrusive as I possibly can. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to exit out. And I'm simply going to say format flash. So what I'm doing right now is I'm formatting the flash device on router 8. And take a look at that. It says that it was just formatted. So if I was to say dir, you can see that we see the same thing we saw before. And here's the key. And this is a very critical point. If I just reformatted the flash, can you tell me why it shows that we've got 128 million bits? So in other words, this is 128 megabyte flash card that's in this router. But why is it only showing, so we'll say 60 million, or 60 megabytes as free? If this has just been reformatted, shouldn't I see the same numeric value right here? So what this is telling you is that sure, this bad actor has accessed your router. He has just reformatted the flash drive. wiping everything on that flash drive out. But guess what? The delta between 127 million and the 60 million that we're looking at here, what is the delta? Exactly. The delta is our archived off iOS of 15.1. And so again, you can see that we are protected now. But the flash has been reformatted. And now we've got this bad actor remotely here. He's just reformatted the flash, and now he says, you know what, I'm really going to do a number on this guy. I'm going to reload his router, and the bad actor is assuming that it's going to come back up into ROM-mon mode. And so let's see if that is truly what happens. So the config has been modified. Do you want to save? I'll just simply say no. I'm not interested in saving the configuration. And again, we've already saved the configuration over here. And take a look at what's going to happen. So we're going to watch as this boots. And actually, this is going to take around 3 minutes. So I'm going to pause, and we're going to come right back, and then we'll scroll back and take a look. So we'll be right back. All right, so we're picking up right where we left off here. Now, some important points as we scroll down. If we take a look, remember, these were the last two messages that we saw right before this message here. Program load complete entry point, and now it says self-decompressing the image. Now, if you format the flash on a router, and the only iOS that it can boot from is on that flash device, it's right in here where you're typically going to get an error message telling you something about flash :0 maybe, or flash 0: file not found. But it finds the file, and now it's decompressing that image. So again, we typed the dir command, we reformatted the flash remotely, and then reloaded the router. So the expectation would be is that we would end up at the ROM-mon prompt. But we're not going to end up at the ROM-mon prompt. You can see right here, we're booting 15.1.4 M12A, and take a look at the message you get right here. Installed image archive. So there is the version of the iOS. It's an image archive that we created. So you're probably saying, well, wait a second, you said the configuration was still here as well. Well, remember, the configuration is saved off and it's hidden from view. Now, it's not the startup configuration. Remember, we formatted the flash, but we can still get to it. And this is much faster than having to TFTP an iOS image on here. Now I can simply say, no, I don't want to enter the initial configuration. We'll wait for the voice over IP dialog to disappear here. And we're back at the router prompt. So I can move into privilege exec. If I say dir, what do I see? I still see nothing. What if I were to say, excuse me, show secure boot set? Now this is interesting. Remember, the flash has been formatted. There is no configuration running on this router. So it simply tells me that iOS image and configuration resilience is not active because the router, right, the current running config, has nothing telling it that iOS resilience, configuration resilience, is on. All right, so let's get the configuration back. Where is it? How do we get it? Well, we're going to go into global config, and it's this secure boot config command. Now, remember when we did secure boot image, there was nothing that followed it. When we look at secure boot config, now we see the restore command to restore an archived configuration. And we're going to call it flash. And now what follows here is this is where I want to put the restoration. Let me back up and show you the full context. Again, fully qualified file path to restore the configuration to. Well, I'm going to put it in flash, and we're just going to simply call it saved the day, right? and we'll say .cfg. So here you go. Even though it thought that the image, the iOS configuration resilience was off, it's not active, it's because the running config showed nothing saying that it was. But we know that it was because we configure all of our routers like this. So now we get this iOS resilience configuration successfully restored. Well, if that's the case, I should see the config right there. And we do. So there's my configuration. In fact, if I was to say more save-the day.cfg, and I'm sorry, do more. Forgot we were up one level here. So there's the configuration. So here are the two commands that were in the original running config that we saved off, right? But we had a bad actor get onto the router, format the flash, wipe everything out, and then reload the router. But here we are, mere seconds from being able to restore everything back to the way it was. So we'll say end, and now what command? We've restored it, right? But you can clearly see that it isn't in play yet because we're still at this router # prompt. So this is where config replace comes in, or configure replace. And we're simply going to replace the current running config with our saved the day.cfg. I hit enter. It's going to ask me if you'd like to proceed. I'm going to say absolutely. We get the configuration lock. The rollback takes place. Take a look at that. We've got the router 8 prompt. The fast Ethernet interface is up. Let me see. Can I ping 10.0.28.2? The router from which the bad actor originated? Absolutely. So we have restored everything that was originally on this router. And keep in mind, the flash was formatted when prior to this going on, right? And we were able to pull everything back without any issues at all. So it's here where we're going to transition briefly to do a quick review. So verification and validation. We saw the command that we would need to run, the show secure boot set. Remember that the iOS image is no longer visible. We saw the syslog messages, and how are they hiding that in the config? We saw that as well. They basically name the file and start the file name with a period, making it hidden, just like you would see in a Linux or a Unix environment. Now, this slide right here is an important one. When we talked about the statement that I was making, that you can't see the archived config, right? The backup config, and you can't see the iOS image unless you are where? Exactly, unless you are in ROM-mon mode. Then when I say dir flash, look what I see. Hey, there's my iOS image. Here's the resilience, that the fact that the iOS configuration resilience is turned on, data file, right? And then here is our, and notice, they both begin with what? A period, making them hidden. And that is the running config archive. Remember, it's not the startup config that you're pulling, it is, or that you're backing up, or that you're archiving. It is the running config. And you can see we get a little timestamp here that goes along, that goes along with it. And here are your permissions, read, write, and then this guy right there would be your execute bit if it was on. And this is, again, these are Linux and Unix type terms that we're talking about here with the permission bits and things like that. But again, this is how they hide the information from view, is they start the file names with a period, and this is just simply shifted and hidden. So even if somebody gained remote access, and even if that individual was a bad actor and had bad intentions and was doing malicious things, the fact that we have enabled Cisco's iOS configuration resilience means that we could recover in mere minutes, as opposed to having to find the proper iOS image, get it onto the TFTP server or onto the laptop we're going to use as a TFTP server, getting to the router and then making those adjustments, right? So now we'll talk about disabling the feature. So what if I decide that iOS resilient configuration is not for me? Now remember, it must be done from the console port. We saw what happened when you tried to disable it from the VTY lines. It kicks up a syslog message and lets us know that someone's trying to disable it. So all we have to do is say no secure boot config and no secure boot image. As you would, in typical Cisco fashion, we just simply precede the activation command with the keyword no. And that's going to be enough to go ahead and disable things. So let's talk real briefly about our summary, and let's discuss use cases here. So Cisco iOS Resilient Configuration is an amazing feature. Not only is it good for production environments, but I want you to think about this. If you teach, or if you work in a lab environment where you've got multiple people accessing hardware, let's say that maybe a student doesn't understand what the format command would do, or saw it somewhere and is running it, or runs it by accident and wipes out the flash. Wouldn't it be great to have Cisco's iOS Resilient Configuration configured on that router? Because as an instructor or as a student, it's much easier to simply reload the router and have it come up with no configuration, but at least to have it come up instead of coming up to ROM-MON mode. In fact, an interesting side note, I ordered a Cisco 2911 off of eBay quite some time ago, and when the router showed up, it was interesting. The first thing I typically do is I load the latest and greatest Cisco iOS on there. So I went to do that, but I wanted to see what version they were currently running, and the flash was empty. So what was interesting was I checked to see if secure boot set was on, and it came back and told me, no, the iOS Resilient Configuration for the boot image said no, that's not activated, it's not on, just like it did for us here. But now that you've seen this, you know better. You know that it has to be on. If there's no iOS image in there, there's no way that the router is going to be able to boot, that it should have ended up in ROM-MON mode. The fact that you type dir and there's nothing in flash and that router booted tells you right away that router has the iOS Resilient Configuration commands have been placed onto it. All right, so this is going to wrap up our tutorial. Again, this is an amazing feature, something that I highly recommend that you enable on your Cisco routers that are running iOS. All right, thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate your time. Hopefully this is going to add some value to your skill set as well as maybe to your production environment. So thank you very much. Have a great evening.